So good afternoon and hearty welcome to Congregation Nishmat Am's Adult Education Premier Speaker Series. I'm Yitzchak Cohen. I'm the very proud rabbi of this wonderful and unique congregation. Today, the final speaker in this provocative and engaging series featuring prominent scholars from around the world and presenting topics relevant to our Jewish community. Is everyone muted? It's important that you mute yourselves. And again, please direct all your questions and comments to Dr. David Peterson in the chat room. We are proud to present this series in conjunction with our community partners, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UTD, the Institute for Global Study of Anti-Semitism and Policy, and the Southwest Jewish Congress. At this time, I'd like to turn this over to our friend and brother and wonderful member, Dr. David Patterson, who in essence made this series possible for us. And so we are certainly indebted to him and to Jerry, his beautiful wife. And Dr. Patterson, I'd like to call upon you to introduce our guest speaker today.
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce a very close friend, Dr. Charles Asher Small. We have worked together on various projects with ISGAP, which, as the rabbi mentioned, is one of the sponsors of this series. This is the last installment of 5 speakers, but we've saved, I think, the best for last. Dr. Small is the founder and the executive director of ISGAP. And he is the director of the ISGAP Wolf Institute Fellowship Training Program on Critical Anti-Semitism Studies at Cambridge. ISGAP is working with Cambridge and when working with the top scholars throughout the world. Dr. Small has convened groundbreaking seminars on contemporary anti-Semitism at Columbia, Harvard, McGill, the National University of Kyiv, which is a city, the Sapienza, University of Rome, the Sorbonne, Stanford, Yale. He has done numerous programs at Oxford. He has a PhD, has his doctorate from Oxford. So you can see that Dr. Small comes with quite an impressive pedigree. He has published numerous volumes. His volumes include a 6-volume work, Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, a 3-volume series, Anti-Semitism in Comparative Perspective. In the announcement for this talk, you saw the cover of one of his more recent publications, Anti-Semitism and Pedagogy. Dr. Small has single-handedly had what I think is perhaps the most profound impact on dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism throughout the world. He is a man of intellect, insight, courage, and commitment. So I could go on, but for now, let me turn this over to Dr. Charles Asher Small. Dr. Small, please.
Thank you, David. So first of all, it's a great honor for me to be here. So Rabbi Cohn, nice to meet you, and thank you for hosting this. And David, thank you very much for your friendship, and I'm honored to work with you. You're a scholar and a gentleman, and you're a mentor to me. So the nice things you said about me are a reflection of you in many ways. So thank you. So good evening. I'm actually in Israel now. So good afternoon in Texas and good evening in Israel. So today I'm going to be speaking about issues of teaching about anti-Semitism, the goal of putting contemporary anti-Semitism studies on the academic map. And it's not an easy task. And I think we have to, David and my colleagues and I, have to be very creative in trying to establish contemporary anti-Semitism studies in academia. There's the old adage that they love dead Jews. It's easy to study old anti-Semitism, religious Christian forms of anti-Semitism, and Nazi fascist forms of anti-Semitism, but to deal with contemporary issues, to deal with the attack on Jews as a people, on Israel, on Zionism, on Jews in diasporas in Europe, and now more so even in North America, is a challenge. And I think we have to be creative. And this, I guess, Jewish capacity to be creative reminds me of a story. It was 1947 in Tel Aviv. It was a hot summer night. It was before the creation of the State of Israel. And David Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Zionist movement were hosting representatives of His Majesty, the British who were ruling over Palestine at the time. And Ben-Gurion was at the high table, a few seats away from the governor. And it was a fancy, black tie event. And in the middle of the dinner, it was so hot, this is before air conditioning, Ben-Gurion undid his bow tie and took off his jacket and put the jacket on the back of his chair and rolled up his sleeves and made himself comfortable. At which point, the governor of Palestine became angry and incensed, and he wrote a note and he gave it to his assistant. The assistant brought it over to Ben-Gurion, and the note said, "This is a formal British event, and taking off your tie and jacket will be a diplomatic, will create diplomatic tensions between the Zionist movement and His Majesty. Put your jacket and hat and bow tie on immediately." And Ben-Gurion very calmly wrote back to the governor a note, and he simply said, "It's okay. Churchill told me it's fine." And he gave it to the assistant of the governor. The governor brought it to the governor. The governor reads the note at the high table, and he becomes even more upset and red and angry. So at the end of the dinner, the governor goes over to Ben-Gurion. He's just very upset. He already had sent his orders to send a telex to 10 Downing Street to talk about Ben-Gurion being disrespectful to His Majesty. And the governor said, "And by the way, what do you mean that Churchill said it was okay for you to do this?" So he said, "Yeah, a few months ago, the leaders of the Zionist movement were in 10 Downing Street, and it was a very hot summer day, unusual for London. And Ben-Gurion was meeting with the British cabinet and Churchill and the leaders of the Zionist movement. And in the middle of the meeting, it was warm. So Ben-Gurion took off his tie and undid his top button and put the jacket of his suit on the back of the chair, and he rolled up his sleeves. And Churchill turned to Ben-Gurion and he said, 'I don't give a damn what you do in Palestine, but at 10 Downing Street, put on your suit.'" That's the story. So, in a way, I guess we have to be creative and have a little bit of chutzpah to fight for our rights, the establishment of the State of Israel, and now in our confrontation against growing forms of anti-Semitism. And I think establishing the study of anti-Semitism needs to, dictates that we be creative and think outside the box in many ways. So at ISGAP, as David said, I'm the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. You can see our website if you want online at www.isgap.org. And what our main mission is the establishment of anti-Semitism studies, contemporary anti-Semitism studies. And what we do, we have 60 research fellows, research projects, as David says, we publish. And one of the key things that we do is every summer at Oxford University, we train professors and help them with their expertise and our expert scholars to help each professor to create a course in their discipline on contemporary anti-Semitism. We have now more than 350 graduates. We've been doing this for 8 years from more than 25 countries, and we help them to create a course, and they go back to their home university and teach it in their university. So we do that. And as David mentioned, we just started a training program for postdocs, young, brilliant scholars with a future career that they'll pursue. And they spend 2 years with us at Cambridge, and hopefully 2 years at Cambridge working with us, helping them to publish and to look deeply into this area of study will prepare them for a good tenure track job at a good university. And we're trying to turn out as many young scholars like this as possible to push the creation of the study of anti-Semitism in universities. When we started the teacher training program in Oxford 8 years ago, there were literally no courses on contemporary anti-Semitism in universities, which is an amazing thing given the legacy and the pedigree of anti-Semitism, particularly in Western civilization. ISGAP, we started ISGAP about 20 years ago, and we created the first center ever at a North American or South American university on issues of anti-Semitism. This was in 2006. So imagine all the centers on issues of racism, as there should be, on women's studies, as there should be, on gender studies, as there should be, now on queer studies, as there should be. It took until 2006 to create the first center at a North American university ever on anti-Semitism. So you can see the deficit in academia on this issue. And as you know, I think what takes place in universities is very important because this is where future leaders are trained and educated. So the fact that contemporary anti-Semitism was not a subject matter and is really very heavily underrepresented in universities is a problem, because as a society you can see that we're not well versed on issues of anti-Semitism. Political leaders, intellectual leaders, top journalists don't quite know how to handle contemporary anti-Semitism. They feel more comfortable dealing with the past forms of anti-Semitism, but to deal with Jews who are under threat of anti-Semitism is more problematic. You know, what is anti-Semitism? Is a demonization of Israel a form of anti-Semitism or a political expression that should be freely expressed, which is, I think, in many places, particularly on the left, a prevailing view. So it's challenging. So this is the context in which we are operating at the academic level. So intellectually, after the Holocaust, there was the emergence of the Frankfurt School of Thought. The Frankfurt School was founded by Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, mainly German Jewish intellectuals, or a few non-Jews, but there were the majority, like Horkheimer and Adorno, Hannah Arendt, others who went through the Holocaust, survived the Holocaust, created the Frankfurt School. In the Frankfurt School, after the Holocaust, this is in the aftermath of the Holocaust, naturally, people were looking at the emergence of Nazism and fascism, the emergence of Hitler. There was a famous book on the authoritarian personality. You know, how did Hitler emerge? What was the psychological, the political, the cultural implications of the emergence of fascism and Nazism, of anti-Semitism, and of course, the Shoah, right? And the Jews were portrayed obviously as the victims, and the Nazis obviously and clearly as the perpetrators of one of the most horrific acts of inhumanity in the history of humanity. Adorno famously said that not only did the Jews die at Auschwitz, but Western civilization ultimately dies in Auschwitz, if you think about it, right? So it was very clear, and this school of thought until the 1960s and 70s was a very influential form of thinking which dealt with the reality in the aftermath of the Shoah. and portrayed anti-Semitism and fascism, I think, in a way that everybody on this call would by and large accept as dealing with reality and with truth. In the 1970s and the 1980s, while the Frankfurt School was still important in academia, dominant, if you will, in academia, we have the emergence of Edward Said. Edward Said claimed to be Palestinian, but he wasn't. He was actually an Egyptian Christian who was very much anti-Israel, as you know, those who are in the world of academia know full well who Edward Said is and how he represented Israel and Palestinians in philosophical thought, in literature, and in politics. Said famously said that he, this Palestinian, he portrayed himself as Palestinian, was the last remaining Jewish intellectual. That he was the last remaining Jewish intellectual because the Jewish intellectuals were in American suburbs getting fat, is what he said, and that the Jewish intellectuals, while they were consuming and getting fat in suburban America, were also supporting the modern day fascism and Nazism of the time, mainly the Zionist entity, mainly Israel. So he was the last true Jewish intellectual, and the Palestinians were the Jews. They were the victims of Jewish Nazism, fascism, and apartheid colonialism. Now, he said this in the 1970s, which was basically dismissed as a bit crazy, sort of off the wall, off the charts of rational discourse and thought. However, as we move philosophically, as the intellectual environment has shifted from modernity, sort of rational social sciences and thought, like the Frankfurt School and other schools of thought, we've emerged or evolved into this sort of postmodern moment where Said, people like Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, kind of this critical postmodern thinking, which is perhaps the most dominant form, sort of philosophical worldview in academia that's being portrayed today, or certainly a very important perspective in academic and philosophical thought, really by and large is extraordinarily critical of Israel, of Zionism, and of Jewish peoplehood. And in fact, one could argue that the better the university is in the United States, like the Ivy Leagues, or in Canada, like McGill, the University of Toronto, or in France, like the Sorbonne, or in Oxford, or in England rather, like Oxford or Cambridge, that in these top intellectual schools where postmodernism and that sort of philosophical outlook, kind of Said and Foucault and the like, that the more people are educated in these fine institutions, the more anti-Israel and anti-Zionist the students are indoctrinated or educated to be. And these are the universities where, as I said earlier, our leaders of business, our future journalists, our future professors are educated, and the miseducation when it comes to Jewish peoplehood, Israel, and Zionism is off the charts. So how has this emerged? And I think there's many reasons for the emergence. Before I deal with that, I think also what's important is that Edward Said and Michel Foucault, another important postmodern philosopher, in the 1970s were spending time with the exiled members of what has become the leaders of the Iranian revolutionary regime. They would spend time with these Islamic leaders in France, and Said and Foucault were writing widely that the leaders, the exiled leaders of the Islamic revolutionary regime were basically akin to what the French Revolution was to Enlightenment. The leaders of the Islamic Revolution of Iran would be the same to the Islamic world, that they were going to bring democracy and inclusion. This despite, as we know, their vulgar anti-Semitism. Their anti-Semitism, which comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which David Patterson is an expert of, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm not speaking about Muslims or Islam as a religion, but the Muslim Brotherhood, which emerges in Egypt roughly 100 years ago, takes a very narrow, reactionary version of Islam and connects it to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most pernicious form of European anti-Semitism known to in history. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, as we know, lay the foundation for the Holocaust. It purports of a Jewish conspiracy, of Jewish people trying to take over the economy and government and banking and all these lies. And those words and ideas of the protocols of the Elders of Zion basically leads to the movement of Nazism and fascism, which removed Jews from society and results in the final solution. And as Elie Wiesel always said, that anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, did not begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums, the bricks and mortar, but began with words and ideas. And the words and ideas of the protocols of the Elders of Zion is rooted at the core, not the periphery, not the radical element of the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, but as a core element of their ideology. And this was the ideology, although Shiite and not Sunni, of the Iranian revolutionary regime. So here's Edward Said and Michel Foucault and other Western progressive postmodern intellectuals ignoring or I dare say acquiescing and perhaps even participating in a reactionary social movement that called for not only the subjugation of women, not only the murder of gay people, but the complete annihilation of the Jewish people as well as Israel, based on the lies and based on the ideology that drove fascism and Nazism to commit the Holocaust. That this is the level of the acquiescence of anti-Semitism among intellectuals that are important, if not dominant, in the universities. So it's an incredible thing what I'm saying, but this is what's happening in our universities today. I would say very crudely that there are three major phases of anti-Semitism historically. I'll be very brief and in my description, so forgive me for collapsing complicated, complex processes and a history into a few moments. But the three phases are basically religious, racial, and an attack on Jews, who Jews are as a people. And I would like to point out to the phenomenon that makes anti-Semitism unique in that, and I say this as a scholar, quoting people like Robert Wistrach and Elie Wiesel and other top scholars of the field, is that anti-Semitism is inherently genocidal, which is different than other forms of racism and sexism and homophobia, as destructive and inhumane as they are. They're not necessarily inherently genocidal, whereas anti-Semitism is, and I'll explain why. During the religious phase of anti-Semitism, mainly in Europe, among Christians, there was the belief that one had to accept the Christian notion of the Messiah in order to have redemption, right? And the Jews did not accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. So there was a belief that the Jews were blinded by evil or the devil, and they could not have redemption. Now that's bad in and of itself, that a group of people would think that others who do not accept their view of reality or of theology would condemn those who don't believe their way as being unworthy of redemption. This is very deeply contradictory to Judaism, where we know and we teach, Rabbi Cohn and David Patterson and others will know, that we believe that everybody's created in the image of God, right? And everybody has a divine element to their being, to their soul, right? Judaism does not create a hierarchy or criteria for non-Jews to be perceived as being created in the image of God or worthy of any form of redemption or a certain type of meaningful relationship to God. We accept the other. This is, I think, a beautiful part of Jewish religion and ethics. So not only did the Christians believe that the Jew was unable to have redemption, but they also pushed the envelope further, saying that the Jews who don't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah were hindering world redemption. So the fact that there was not world redemption was the fault of the stubborn Jews. And of course, this belief created pogroms, discrimination, forced conversions, and the like. But there was an out for the Jews. If they had to save themselves, if they converted, they would be physically saved from persecution to an extent. When religion shifted, or the dominant worldview shifted from religion to notions of race and ethnicity and biology and nation, the Jews living in places in Europe and in the Middle East for many, many generations, for centuries, were suddenly perceived as outsiders to the nation and place that they lived. And unlike religion, the sort of scientific notions of race, there was a belief in European science and social science and theology that race was inherent, that no matter how you mastered a culture or civilization, no matter if you played classical music or spoke a dozen languages, that you can't escape the inherent notion of your racial identity. And Jews were perceived not only as a different race, as a Semitic race and not a white race, but there was a belief that the Jews posed a threat to the purity of the white Aryan race, and that this form of racist anti-Semitism led to the Holocaust. That if you take the notion of Jews poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, you can see how this leads to this racist form of anti-Semitism leads to the Holocaust. Now today, particularly at universities or at the media of record, if anybody articulated an old Christian form of anti-Semitism or an old racist form, a Nazi fascist form of anti-Semitism, I think in most institutions, at most universities, at most good media outlets, in the political world, if any elected official articulated those old archaic forms of anti-Semitism, I think they would be in serious trouble. They can lose their job, lose their career, unless they apologized with a deep sense of legitimacy to their apology if it was accepted. So this is no longer accepted in liberal circles. But today, the dominant form of anti-Semitism, the form of anti-Semitism which is not only accepted, but I would submit to you, it's encouraged. And the more people engage in contemporary forms of anti-Semitism at the university, in the media of record, they are rewarded. I'll repeat this. The more anti-Semitism in the dominant form of contemporary anti-Semitism, to attack Israel, to attack Jewish notions of peoplehood, that this type of anti-Semitism is not only accepted, but I think those who articulate it are actually awarded. They're awarded with good positions in academia, with good positions in the media of record. And we can see the delegitimization of Israel and Jewish peoplehood as the dominant form of the three anti-Semitisms today. So I think also in the United States of America for decades, progressive liberal American Jews would often say that if it wasn't for the stubborn Israelis, if the Israelis and the Palestinians could just settle their conflict, then the problems would go away. But as we see, more and more Jewish communities in Europe in particular, and now it's come to Canada, and certainly it's arrived in the United States in the last few years in a significant and serious way, that it's not just a problem for our Israeli brothers and sisters, but it's a problem for Jewish communities throughout the world. So if young Jewish people at universities go to Hillel or go to Chabad or go to a Jewish organization, and if Israel in the classroom, in political discourse, is taught as a colonial state, as Israel is an apartheid state, and if Israel is an apartheid state from a liberal human rights perspective, it must be dismantled because apartheid is a crime against humanity. So those who are accusing Israel of being an apartheid colonial state is essentially, from a liberal perspective, calling for it to be dismantled. So if Israel is an apartheid racist colonial state, and nice young Jewish American kids go to Hillel, go to Chabad, identify as being Zionist, identify as being connected to our people's heritage and the place of the land of Israel in our culture, in our religion, is of tremendous centrality and importance, then if they articulate those views, they are perceived as being an enemy of anti-racism, of postmodernity, and sort of this sort of multicultural, multi-narrative approach of postmodernity in the university. So they are perceived as enemies. If people are going to shul in Paris, in Berlin, in London on Shabbat, and they're going to pray facing Jerusalem and facing Israel, then the synagogue is an articulation of supporting this racist apartheid colonial entity, and the synagogue and the Jewish community are now singled out from the progressive intellectual left as being a problem. And of course, we have the rise of right-wing racism and nationalism and fascism in Europe, and I dare say in Canada and the United States, the emergence of the extreme right and even violent elements of that part of the political spectrum is also becoming an increasing problem against the Jewish people, more from a racist perspective. And of course, we have political Islam, which is significant in the Middle East, but also in Europe in particular, in places like France and Germany, where there's immigrants, first, second, third generation of immigrant communities from the Middle East, where political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and the demonization of Israel and Jewish people based on this sort of mixture of Islam and European fascism is of also concern. So the demonization of Israel comes from the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam, from the extreme postmodern left, and now also from the right. So the Jewish community is sort of stuck in the middle of this sort of emerging forms or processes associated with anti-Semitism. So if Israel is an apartheid racist state in these ideologies and contemporary intellectual circles, you can imagine that those of us like David, myself, and many colleagues that are dealing with anti-Semitism, when we point out as scholars, based on stellar, high caliber research from some of the finest scholars on the subject matter in the world, and we show the connection between the Muslim Brotherhood and Nazism or fascism, or how the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and the Iranian regime and Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, use the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most pernicious lie of European anti-Semitism, in their portrayal of Israel, for example. And we do this as scholars. We're dismissed as advocates of the Zionist entity, right? Because of this sort of intellectual environment, we're dismissed not only as intellectuals, but we're labeled as Zionist activists. And I dare say, which is an extraordinary thing, what we do at our summer institute, the last day of our summer institute, there's a woman, her name is Mrs. Landau. Mrs. Landau came from Poland. She survived the Holocaust. And I won't do justice to her story, but I'll just tell you briefly, and then I'll open this up to Q&A. Mrs. Landau speaks about how she grew up in Warsaw with her family. The Nazis came to power. They were put in a ghetto. From the ghetto, her community, her neighbors were sent on a train to Auschwitz. Her brother and father escaped the train from Auschwitz, and they went to the forest, and they were living in the forest off of insects and leaves and and grass, if you will. And after months of near starvation in the forest, they were found and discovered by the SS, and about 100 Jewish people were rounded up by the SS, and they were forced to dig a pit, and they were lined up against the pit. And just before everybody was executed, Mrs. Landau's father pushed her into the pit seconds before everybody was shot, and she survived, managed to crawl out of the pit. She went to a nearby farm where a Christian family took her in and nursed her back to health. She eventually made her way to Israel. She got married. She had 3 children. She has grandchildren. And it's sort of a remarkable story of survival, and survival of a horrendous, despicable moment in history of the Shoah. And she speaks about how her family and her community were exterminated because they were perceived as not being white, as being part of a Semitic race that was poisoning through conspiracies the purity of the white Aryan race and the German people. Right? Today, the intellectuals are telling her that she is not only an apartheid racist colonialist, but that the Jewish people are white, and not that they're white or were white and because sorry for what happened in the Shoah, welcome to the club. No. Now the Jewish people in intellectual circles are being labeled as white and the quintessential white supremacists, that we are better than the whites of Jim Crow America. We are better than the worst apartheid supporters of South Africa. This is what's passing as political discourse at Harvard, at Yale, at Georgetown. And part of the reason for this phenomenon, and we've been working on it, is that the Muslim Brotherhood, namely countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, have been pumping billions of dollars into American universities, which have not been, much of it has not been declared by the universities. And this use of soft power is shifting the university curriculum and the discourse of scholars who push this type of anti-Semitic demonization of who Jews are as a people in our best universities. And through our research, we found $3 billion of undocumented money. There was a federal investigation that was launched in part because of our research. The federal investigation found $18 billion, and the Biden administration shut down the investigation in part because foreign funding is lucrative for many universities and for many interests, not just from the Gulf, but from China, and I guess before this recent conflict from Russia. So universities are susceptible to these funds, and the use of soft power by nefarious sources is really, for the last almost 2 generations that we know of, shifting the discourse when it comes to Israel, but not only Israel, but also to American Jewry. So the universities are literally a front line, and I'm choosing my words carefully, in the contemporary war against the Jewish people. The universities are the front line in the war against the Jewish people in the United States of America. And this is where we're at, ladies and gentlemen, and I think these are very, very serious issues that our community needs to be aware of, and through this awareness, develop strategies that are effective in fighting back against anti-Semitism. Because right now, as you know, our community is really facing a serious challenge on how to understand, to map and decode this war against the Jewish people, and how to develop strategies to combat it. I think there's a role that we play in this sort of struggle against anti-Semitism, kind of in the intellectual environment to understand it properly, but it has to be a multi-pronged approach from our Jewish organizations that are fighting anti-Semitism. I think synagogues and rabbis, just like in the struggle for freeing Soviet Jewry, I think rabbis need to speak up and speak to their communities about these issues, and it's wonderful that your congregation is doing such an important series, but there needs to be sort of a multidimensional understanding and approach to combating anti-Semitism. And I think, Elie Wiesel said in 2003 that we're living in a time of great urgency, that he was never so terrified of the reemergence of anti-Semitism in 2003 as he was in 1945. And he went on to correct himself and he said, no, this is not a time of great urgency. It's a time of an emergency. And we know from 2003 to 2022, that things have not gotten better. So I'll end there and I'll be happy to take questions or comments.
Wow. Thank you, Charles, Dr. Small. Very powerful, very disturbing, very moving on many levels. We have a question from from Dr. Price, Kenny Price. He says, it appears that as in the Black community is our biggest problem, or anti-Semitism in the Black community is our biggest problem. We have 25 to 35,000 card-carrying members of the Nation of Islam, whose leader spouts anti-Semitism invectives commonly, identical with the words of Adolf Hitler. Nation of Islam is protected because it is Black. One study has found that anti-Semitism among Blacks is highly positively correlated with years of education. So, says Dr. Price, affirmative action and preferences are a danger to the Jews. What are we to do? What are your thoughts? You have thoughts on this? Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's truth in Dr. Price's comments and question. There is anti-Semitism in the African-American community. The Nation of Islam has been heavily engaged in the demonization of Israel and Jewish Americans. They are, the ADL and other Southern Poverty Law Center. I think any human rights organization that looks at the Nation of Islam understands that it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-democratic, it's Farrakhan is an ugly but effective rhetorical leader. So it's dangerous. The Nation of Islam, for example, works with the Students for Justice in Palestine. During the Ferguson riots or uprising, Palestinians and African-American radicals used the police brutality and the situation in Ferguson to come up with the sort of from Ferguson to Gaza. They used this as an opportunity to try to portray Palestinians as Black and the Jews as white. So yes, the Nation of Islam is repugnant and should be condemned. And I don't think we should walk around as white liberals, but we should walk around as Jews, and we should speak out against anti-Semitism from wherever it comes. If it's the African-American community or white supremacists or some of the supporters of President Trump or some of the radical members of the Democratic Party. That, anti-Semitism unfortunately does not know any political bounds, and we should speak out against all of its manifestations and forms. So having said that, I think we have to be very careful and understand, that any form of bigotry is a problem in terms of those of us who believe in democracy and, notions of equality, of a robust notion of citizenship, or citizens under one legal system. That any form of discrimination, be it anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and certainly racism, should be condemned. Even though there may be poor or rich people who are anti-Semitic, or white or Black people who are anti-Semitic, I think we should always be promoting democratic notions of citizenship and democracy and speak out against anybody who tries to weaken it. And I think we also need to be mindful that it's true that there are higher levels of anti-Semitism among the African-American community in comparison to other communities. That's true. But I think we also have to be mindful that there is a history and a legacy of cooperation and sympathy in the African-American community to anti-Semitism. Certainly the civil rights movement had strong cooperation with the Jewish community, and Martin Luther King and other leaders of the civil rights movement. That legacy maybe was the best moment in African-American and Jewish American relations. And I think that there are African-Americans who are aware of that legacy. And I think there are more and more African-Americans as anti-Semitism unfortunately becomes more prevalent in the United States of America. There are leaders of the African-American community who are concerned and are speaking out. So I think to dismiss the African-American community is wrong, and it would be politically and strategically stupid to do that. And I also think that there is a legacy of racism in the United States of America. We know the legacy of slavery. We know the legacy of Jim Crow. We know that in any American city today, there is abject segregation, whether we like to say it or not. I recently moved and spent time in Miami. Miami, or elements of Miami, is one of the most multicultural, diverse, dynamic, young, vibrant cities in the United States of America, which includes Jews and Latinos and African Americans and a religious Jewish community and rich and poor. It's a lot of wonderful things are happening in Miami. But in the space where all this wonderful stuff is happening, like every American city, go 5 miles here or 5 miles there. And we know that the African-American community is stuck in time, stuck in space. They don't have access to the resources that Jewish Americans and most Americans have. And I think that condition breeds horrific forms of dehumanization, of notions that are antithetical to who we are as Jewish people. Antithetical to who we are as Jewish people. And I think guided by our ethics and our worldview of what a human being is and how a human being is created, in what image a human being is created, that we need to be, I think, mindful of that legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, which unfortunately affects a large segment of the African-American community, which contributes to all sorts of terrible social, economic, political, cultural phenomenon, including the demonization of Jewish people, including the objectification of women. There's a lot of issues. And I think we need to work and build bridges with the community, with good leaders in the community, to try to bring about understanding and more humanity. So I don't think this community should be dismissed as simply anti-Semitic. I think it's much more complicated than that.
Thank you, Dr. Small. There's a comment in the chat. This is something I didn't know. You know, Nardine Kiswani will be speaking here in Dallas at the University of Texas at Dallas tomorrow for Israel Apartheid Week, which I've been to the campus every day this last week, and I haven't seen any announcements about Israel Apartheid Week or Nardine Kiswani, in case you don't know, was deemed the anti-Semite of the year by the Jerusalem Post. And she's known for her demonization and incitement, demonization of Israel, incitement of hatred for Israel, as you know, the apartheid state is, which is hateful, right? As Dr. Small pointed out. I have something I want to bring up with you, Dr. Small, Charles. You mentioned a couple of times the idea, the teaching concerning the dearness of a human being. What is a human being? Jewish tradition teaches the holiness of the human being lies in the image and likeness of God in which we were created. Which not only calls us to to hold the other human being dear, but it calls us to a certain responsibility to and for the other human being, and it points to a bond between us. We're all in Hebrew. The word for Hebrew human being is Ben Adam. Each of us is a child of Adam. We're related. Isn't this view antithetical to postmodern thinking or to critical race theory, that each of us is bound by to the other by the creator or by the holiness of the other? I mean, this is certainly not that way of thinking. I do not find in academia where I live.
Yeah. No, I agree. No, look, this is your area of scholarship. You've taught me a lot in this area. So what I'm going to say is with a lot of humility, sincere humility, because I know you're really at another level when it comes to this type of work. But as you know, I appreciate the work of Emmanuel Levinas, and Emmanuel Levinas was the first scholar, in a sense, that brought Jewish thought, ethics, Talmud, to Western universities. And I know you're a fan and scholar of Levinas, but one of the things that really was sort of mind-blowing to me when I was reading him was that he shows, as opposed to kind of European liberal notions of tolerance, to tolerate the other, in Jewish ethics, we're taught that we need the other. And Levinas was saying that the moment we see our face in the face of the other, the moment we see our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we become human. So we need the other to be human. We need to recognize the godliness in the other for us to be human. So it's not tolerance. It's not like, to tolerate is almost taking a stance of being superior. I can, tolerate you. Who am I to tolerate you? Whereas Judaism, it's humility of really, we need the other to be human. So if we're racist or sexist or classist, we eliminate billions of opportunities to be a human being, to be human. So we harm ourselves. So it's a very different perspective of acceptance. So
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah.
No, I think you're very insightful here, and it's not just the other who looks like me. It's the stranger who is not like me, right? And this is why we're commanded 36 times, or the most frequently repeated commandment, to love, look after, care for the stranger. That is the one who's not like me. The neighbor, is my buddy. I can get along with him, but it's the one who's not like me. And that's where I think in a lot of the postmodernist thinking about culture studies, race studies, gender studies, it's more about drawing lines of separation rather than avenues of connection and relation, in many cases. I have another question.
Especially when it comes to Israel and the Jews.
Yes, and as you say, it doesn't end with that. I have a question from Dr. David Kolinsky, a good friend. He says, is anti-Semitism and racism in general more of an outgrowth of political perspectives or more of an expression of personal anger and resentment? From the Jewish side, says Dr. Kolinsky, from the Jewish side, I've seen much more mention of the Arab Rav Amalek and only Jews possessing a neshama.
The notion that only Jewish people have a neshama?
Yeah.
As a response to hatred, or
as a response to Amalek, to the evil one bent on the destruction of the Jews. It's
So, yeah.
that's not Torah, that only Jews have a neshama. That's not what the Torah teaches in my reading of the Torah.
Mine too.
But he's as a reflection of Jewish anger. Oh, this is interesting that Dr. Kolinsky adds. Yeah, I mean, Jews, I mean, this being the object of hatred does something insidious to the Jewish soul, right? It wears us down. And I would say all the more reason to be there for one another, to speak out, as you say, Charles, not as liberals or whatever that means. I don't know what that means, but as Jews.
Right.
I agree. I think there's a response. I think this type of response of maybe out of exasperation, Jews say, well, we have the neshama and they don't. That's, response to hatred. Alternatively, on the other extreme, we see many young Jewish people subjected to hatred at universities, and a significant amount kind of internalize it and join the crowd to get in, to make their lives perhaps a bit easier. And perhaps the most pernicious form of anti-Semitism or hatred of any kind is the internalization of the tropes into the mindset or consciousness of the victim. That's sort of tragic. So maybe there's two extreme examples, and I agree with David that we should try to be, centered and have a Jewish response, an ethical Jewish response to this hatred. And I think also in response to Mr. Kolinsky, to me, I understand the rationality of racism and sexism. As one group wants to dominate another group, so you justify it through science, through social science, through religion. It kind of makes sense. It's unethical, it's pathetic, it's tragic, it causes a lot of damage, but there's a rationale to it. And I think, to be honest, at some level, I don't know, I've been studying anti-Semitism now for 25, 30 years more. And at some level, I don't quite get it. I think it's sort of beyond the rational. It's like peeling an onion. There's so many layers to it. There's a religious layer, and maybe we brought God, we brought ethics. There's that type of response or hatred for those of us who remind people of God and ethics. There's jealousy. Right. There's so many layers. So at some level, it's sort of beyond my comprehension.
I have a question from a good friend in India.
Wow.
Mehak Burza, an aspiring young scholar, someone, Charles, I should introduce you to someday.
We met through messages, but nice to see.
Oh, okay, good. So Mehak says the terms anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are omnipresent in the controversies over the church's responsibility with regard to the extermination of the Jews. How do we draw a line between these two things, anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism? Well, what do you think, Charles?
Is it possible for you, Mac, to try to, can you go deeper into your question? Because I don't quite get it, the question, if you don't mind. Could you expand on it, please? You can unmute. Could you unmute?
Mehak, you can go. Why don't you unmute for Dr. Small, if you can?
Yes, Professor. Hello.
Hi, nice to hear you.
So, Professor, I was wondering that nowadays I've read certain texts which use these terms quite synonymously. But there, of course, under hushed tones, there exist these fuzzy distinctions between both anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So how do we draw a line? How do we see them? Do you see them as separate things or in parallel to each other? Or how do we draw a distinction between both of these?
Right. So it's a good question. So now I understand what you're asking. So, of course, anti-Semitism as a concept was coined by Wilhelm Marr in the 1870s. He was a German scholar, intellectual, who was proud of his Jew hatred, and he coined the phrase anti-Semitism. So it's a form of hatred that was specifically designed, created for the Jewish people of Europe. So I think it's a problematic concept in that there's not a Jewish race. Jews are not a Semitic race. It's a problematic concept and term, but I think it has relevance as a form of European hatred. So I don't think it's a term that necessarily needs to be abolished. It's problematic and filled with all sorts of contradictions. And now there's an argument that some have been using, and I think it has merit, that anti-Semitism, the term, is not a very sort of powerful term. Many people don't know what anti-Semitism is, or who the Semitic people are, and what does it really mean, and are Arabs Semitic, are Jews Semitic? If people ask me questions like, if everybody's focusing on the hatred of Jews as a form of anti-Semitism, what about the hatred of Arab people? And are Jews monopolizing the term for their benefit? So it's twisted in that way. So it's a problematic term, and many people are starting to use the notion of Jew hatred or anti-Judaism as a more accurate, stark term to refer to the hatred of the Jewish people, which that argument has merit. So I think both terms have their use. Where anti-Semitism as a concept is filled with all sorts of contradictions, but many of us understand what the term is and we use it. I don't know if I'm answering your question completely, but yeah. David,
I think look, there's way more to be said. We have more questions, but unfortunately we don't have more time. Let me urge everyone to go to the ISGAP website, isgap.org. Just type that in your Google, ISGAP.org, and it'll bring it up. It's a treasure trove of articles, of information, articles by, as Dr. Small says, by the top scholars in the world, including people like Natan Sharansky and others.
David Patterson,
Charles Small, David Patterson, and Charles Small. Some of those. So go to that website. This is being recorded, and I'll see to it that we send this to ISGAP so you can perhaps post it on the ISGAP site as well, this talk.
Right.
And just the little time I have left, I need to turn this back to Rabbi Cohen to close it out.
Again, thank you very much, everybody. I'm really
Thank you, Dr.
honored
Small.
to see you and participate. Thank you.
You're amazing.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are, Dr. Small. Absolutely phenomenal. And let me just, as a little aside, and based upon something that we all discussed here, that you discussed, and this is that we're all created in God's image, and the Talmud says, Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. How beloved is man, that he's created in God's image. It doesn't say Jews, non-Jews, we're all created in God's image. And as you said, we have to be willing to see the other as created in God's image. And God willing, we pray for that day to come. So how do you shikoach to you, Dr. Small, for a most informative and enlightening, and to quote Dr. Patterson, a moving and powerful presentation and lecture and teaching. It was absolutely wonderful. And we wish you bracha v'atzlacha, as we say, b'chol ma'aseh yadecha, blessing and success in everything that you do. And and may you continue to go Michael El Chaim, from strength to strength, and bring your wonderful, wonderful teachings for many, many, many years to come. This is really a sacred service that you're doing, and we are exceedingly grateful to Dr. David Patterson for making this possible. Another phenomenal scholar, and we are not only grateful, of course, but we are so we're so honored with your friendship and your membership in our synagogue. So God bless you all, and with Pesach around the corner, let all of us wish from our houses to your homes a Chag Pesach Kasher V'Sameach. We have a wonderful, kosher, meaningful, and very joyous Pesach. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All blessings. We'll be in touch, Charles. Oh.
Thank you.